The distributor clutch is a friction clutch. It provides the driving force, essentially, that moves the distributor to the various positions to deliver pins into the bin. The distributor has an adjustable spring on it. This adjusts the tension that the clutch has, or the driving force. Less is better on the clutch. So the ideal range to set the clutch tension is 3/4 to 1 turn of the spring. To set this up, all things being in good condition, start at 3/4 of a turn and run the distributor. The most difficult position for the distributor to be driven by the clutch is between the 6 and the 10, going to the 10 pin. That is when the spring on the other side is being extended and the clutch is fighting against that. If the distributor hesitates going to the 10 pin, add 1 notch of tension until that goes away. If you remove or replace or service the clutch, only do it with the distributor at the head pin, and there's a very good reason for that. This is all timed perfectly, and that timing needs to be maintained for this to work right. On the index cam, right there, there's a little bump. That's the timing mark on the index cam. On the pinion gear, there's one tooth that's shorter than all the other ones. That's the timing mark on the pinion. Those two must line up exactly by the tooth. If it's off by even 1 tooth, the distributor will not be in the proper position and it can cause misfeeds. The stop blade back here is to be set up so that it is directly across from the clutch finger, as you can see here, with the trip stop rod assembly sitting on the bumper. There is a little bit of adjustment room here to pitch the stop blade up and down so you can get that perfect alignment. But if you have that maxed out and it's still not lined up right, most likely the bracket back here for the trip stop rod is bent. You can replace that, or you can take the stop blade off, take it to the bench grinder, and grind down the back side here a little bit, just a little bit. That'll give you more room to move the stop blade up and down to get it lined up. It really does not matter how this is on here, as long as when the trip stop rod is sitting on the bumper, the finger on the stop blade is exactly across from the finger on the clutch. That way, when it indexes, the stop blade will drop down more than enough to get out of the way of the clutch, and then when it releases and the clutch goes around, it'll be in the proper position to stop the clutch and wait for the next pin to trip it to index again. This adjustment will set the distributor carriage. When they talk about the distributor carriage being parallel, what they're referring to is the carriage tube on the distributor being parallel to the trip stop rod. This is extremely important to how well the distributor will run. These two rods must be parallel. The reason for that is the trip rocker, when a pin goes off the end of the distributor, lifts up on the trip stop rod. It must be able to do that to cause a successful and full index in any position, no matter where this is along the trip stop rod. So these two rods must be parallel. If they're not, it's going to have problems doing that. To set that, we'll pretend that we took off all the eccentric rollers and just installed them. So up here, you have the 2 eccentric rollers in the front, an eccentric roller on the top rear, and a concentric roller on the bottom rear. That one is not adjustable, so we'll leave that alone. To start, push the distributor carriage in all the way, adjust the 2 upper rollers all the way up, and the bottom front roller all the way down. This will position the carriage in, and it will be actually tilted down in the back. Then you go to the front upper eccentric roller and adjust that down. that will bring the carriage up back here. Do that until these two rods are exactly parallel. Once you get to that point, go to the front lower eccentric roller and adjust that up until it's snug against the carriage tube. In this case, snug means that it's just tight enough to the carriage tube to be tight, but not so tight that it causes drag when moving the carriage in and out. Then you go to the upper rear concentric or eccentric roller and adjust that down until you get the same thing. Then the carriage is set, and that'll position this so these are parallel, and it'll be nice and snug so there isn't a lot of slop back here. You don't want these tight because then the carriage will have problems pulling in and extending. Another adjustment you need to check or do is the trip rocker. The trip rocker has two nylon rollers on it that sit on either side of the trip stop rod assembly. You need to set those rollers so that they are evenly spaced from the trip stop rod. And this is what I'm talking about. Let me climb over here. Okay, what you are after here is you adjust the trip rod or trip cable until the space between the top roller and the space between the bottom roller and the trip stop rod is exactly the same. You can see I can spin these freely, and you can see that distance is the same. These rollers should never touch the trip stop rod unless a pin is going off of the end of the distributor. You can also use the trip rocker after you have done this to check your eccentric adjustments. With the carriage extended, the distance of the rollers should be set right there. In fact, you can kind of see that they're the same. As you pull the carriage in, keep an eye on the distance. If that changes, that means your adjustment is off. That should be the same no matter where this is along the trip stop rod. The belt tensioner assembly is basically a roller with two brackets on the side and a tracking bracket here that the spring hooks onto with 7 teeth in it, or notches. Ideally, with a good belt and everything else fine, you want the spring to be in the middle, on the middle notch. If you need to move this assembly left and right, you can loosen the clamp stud here on the bottom and the whole thing will slide left and right. Or if you're like some guys, you can just bend this whole assembly left and right. Watch that this isn't twisted this way. If these links are twisted, they can cause the belt to track abnormally. Also, when you are checking this, make sure that the tracking bracket is on the correct way. It goes down from the top. It cannot go this way because on the other side, it will run into the trip casting. The helper extension spring here should be hooked onto the front here as an initial setting. If the belt's good, the belt tension alone will extend the carriage pretty quickly or easily, and the spring will help it. But if you have worn parts, you may have to actually hook this spring onto the tensioner spring or even on the front of the distributor to get the carriage to extend quickly enough. It doesn't really matter. At that point, as long as the distributor is working, it's okay until you can get in there and replace the proper parts. But when the parts are good, this is what it should look like. Distributor height is set by adjusting the shims underneath the distributor support here. When you're talking about distributor height, you're basically talking about how high it is when it's extended over the bin. The distributor should be plumb. What that means is the support post in here is vertically level in all directions, but sometimes that's not possible. So you add shims here. What you should end up with, and the way I set mine, is I'll double stack a 4 or a 6 pin, and the trip arms should just clear the heads of the pins like this. You can see how high it is here. That's good. That puts the distributor in an optimal position or height to deliver pins to the bin. The higher the distributor is over the bin, the more likely pins are going to bounce funny and cause misfeeds. To check if your distributor is level side to side, disconnect both springs on the back here with the distributor positioned at the head pin, and it should pretty much stay where it is. If you move it to one side, it should continue moving that way, or it will stay in position depending on how high up you have the front of it pitched. The higher you have the front of the distributor pitched, the more uphill, downhill it's going to go when it moves from the center to either side. So also, if you move this to the 7 side, it should pretty much stay there or continue falling that way. If you have the distributor on the 7 side and it wants to move to the 10 side, it means that this is not level. And if you look really closely at this one, you can see it doesn't look like it's level. It looks like it's pitched this way. That was done intentionally because I don't know if you can see this. If you look at the distributor support, this is actually crooked. In other words, the distributor support post goes one way and the back of the support goes this way. So I've pitched it this way to make up for that difference. If I took these springs off right now, the distributor would not move. That's ideally what you want. It doesn't matter which way you move this, as long as when you have the distributor at the head pin, it stays still. If you have it off either way, like it's sort of going uphill, downhill, that can cause problems with it moving and excess bouncing and swinging. The trip arms at the front of the distributor should have all 8 rollers in place, should not be bent or twisted, and both bumpers should be in place. But as you can see here on the front bumper, there have been washers added to it to lower the resting position a little bit to make it easier for pins to go over the end and trip the index cam. If you have a distributor where the trip arms are dropping down too far, you can add a washer to the rear bumper to kind of stop the movement of the trip arms down. Doing any of this though, you need to recheck your trip rod or trip cable adjustment to make sure that it's still going to index correctly and that the rollers still have the proper spacing on the trip rocker from the trip stop rod assembly. The orienter pan is mounted to the distributor support casting with 6 bolts or screws and has slots, so it's adjustable front to back. To set this up, put the distributor at the head pin, loosen all 6 of these bolts or screws and push the pan as far back as it will go, even into the elevator. Then take the distributor and swing it all the way to the 7 and the 10 side with the bolts still loose. What this will do is push the pan forward. Then figure out which side the pan is closer to the elevator on, the 7 or the 10, and then add another 1/8 of an inch distance. Then tighten everything down. What this does is it positions the pan as far back as you can get it without it touching the elevator wheel. And if you look here, I can barely get my fingers back here. It's important that the pan is this far back because if it's too far forward, head first pins will have a difficult time turning properly and moving forward quickly on the distributor belt. Now you know how to keep your distributor running smoothly.